We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks.
4 minutes. That was all the palace needed to turn restraint into shock protocol into panic, and one royal title into the kind of private wound no public smile could hide. In this dramatized royal narrative, Camilla entered the room believing the discussion would end, the way these discussions always had, with careful language, delayed consequences, and Charles finding some way to protect the balance. Instead, before those 4 minutes were over, Catherine was named queen in a decision that shattered the order Camilla thought still held. And when the final wording was read, the woman who had spent years fighting to secure her place beside the crown suddenly lost her strength in front of the very people who now understood the truth before she did. Stay with me, because what happened next was not just about a title changing hands. It was about silence, betrayal, and a palace decision so cold that even the people who benefited from it did not look relieved. Camilla did not speak when the first document was opened. She sat still beside Charles, composed, in the way royal life teaches people to be composed when they feel danger approaching, but do not yet know from which direction it will come. Across from her, Catherine kept her posture careful, not tense exactly, but alert in the way someone becomes when they sense that a room has already made up its mind before a single sentence is read aloud. William watched the table, not the walls, not the advisors, not the clerks, but the table itself, because the table was where decisions became permanent. Charles remained silent. That silence was the first warning. In this fictionalized palace account, everyone in that chamber had learned over time that Charles often used softness to delay conflict, but this time there was no soft interruption, no request for additional review, no sign that he intended to slow what was coming. The clerk began reading the settlement, and with every line the meaning became harder to mistake. The role Camilla believed was stable was no longer stable at all. The wording did not sound cruel. Palace language rarely does. That is part of its power. It moves like velvet while cutting like glass. The transfer was described as a ceremonial realignment, a measured response to the changing shape of the monarchy, a formal recognition of Catherine's increasing place beside William and within the future of the institution. But everyone in the room understood what those polished phrases were hiding. Camilla was being displaced, not loudly, not publicly, not yet, but unmistakably. Catherine lowered her eyes, not from victory but from discomfort. In this dramatized scenario, she had not walked into the chamber expecting a triumph built on another woman's humiliation. William noticed that immediately. He knew Catherine well enough to recognize the difference between ambition and burden, and what settled on her in that moment was burden. Camilla, meanwhile, did something much smaller and much more revealing. She turned slightly toward Charles, waiting for him to stop it. He did not. That was the second shock. The first had been the document. The second was the king himself. Camilla kept searching his face for resistance and found only stillness. Not anger, not even approval, just stillness. A devastating kind of stillness, because it meant the decision had crossed beyond debate and entered acceptance. The clerk continued. Catherine's responsibilities would be elevated with immediate effect. New ceremonial precedents would follow. Office support would shift accordingly. Staff structure would be revised. Public presentation would be adjusted in line with the settlement. Each sentence sounded administrative. Each sentence carried the force of exile. Camilla's hand moved to the edge of the table. Her fingers tightened there, almost invisibly at first, as though she were steadying herself against a room that had suddenly tilted. William glanced toward her. Catherine did not move. Charles remained fixed in place. Then the clerk reached the final line, the line that made the transfer immediate rather than symbolic, and the room changed in a single breath. Camilla tried to rise. That was what several people would remember most clearly in the aftermath. Not a scream, not an accusation, not some dramatic interruption worthy of tabloids. She tried to stand with dignity, as if leaving on her own terms was the last piece of control available to her. But the body can expose what pride is trying to conceal. Her chair shifted back, her balance went with it. The color left her face so quickly that even the aides nearest the wall moved before anyone gave an instruction. She reached for the table, missed, and collapsed before the room could decide whether to preserve protocol or respond like human beings. The chamber broke open. Advisors rushed forward. One clerk dropped the second page of the settlement. Charles stood up, too late to prevent anything, and too early to pretend he had not understood the risk. Catherine remained frozen for one stunned second. not out of indifference, but because the cost of the decision had just become visible in a way no document could soften. William moved first toward Camilla, then stopped, realizing the scene had already crossed into something larger than rescue. The title had changed, but what the room would remember was the fall. Camilla was lifted carefully and guided out through a side door with the kind of urgent discretion palaces depend on when they need a crisis to stay quiet for at least a few more minutes. But before she disappeared fully from the room, she turned once toward Charles. Her expression had changed. The first look she gave him had been confused, the second had been wounded. This one was colder. In this imagined royal count, she did not need a long speech. She only needed 3 words: "You knew." That was all, yet it landed harder than any shouted accusation could have. Because now the real question was no longer whether Catherine had been elevated. The question was, who had allowed Camilla to walk into that chamber believing she was safe when the outcome had already been prepared? William understood that instantly. Catherine did too. The meeting was no longer about succession language. It was about whether Charles had sacrificed honesty before he sacrificed hierarchy. And if he had, then the deepest injury in the room had nothing to do with rank. What made the collapse even more devastating in this dramatized version was what William saw when he looked back at the paperwork scattered across the table. Near the lower portion of the settlement sat marks showing preparation dates, notation codes, and prior authorization references. This was not something improvised that morning. It had been built in advance. The framework had already moved through the hands that mattered before the participants took their seats. The decision had structure, it had timing, it had protection. Camilla had not entered a debate. She had entered an ending. Charles understood that William had seen it. Catherine sensed it from William's face before she even glanced at the papers herself. Suddenly, the collapse took on a darker meaning. It was not merely the reaction of a woman hearing bad news. It was the result of discovering that the people closest to her had permitted surprise to do what honesty would not. And nowhere inside a palace is surprise more dangerous than when it arrives dressed as ceremony. Catherine did not celebrate. That mattered. In a lesser story, the transfer would have turned her into a smiling beneficiary. But in this script, the moment landed on her like a weight rather than a reward. She knew already that any rise achieved in the shadow of another woman's public breaking point would come poisoned. William moved closer to her once the chamber thinned out, and she asked the question he knew she would ask: was there any way to slow it now? William did not answer quickly because he understood the cost on both sides. Slowing it after the collapse could look merciful, but it could also make the institution appear panicked, divided, and unsure of its own judgment. Proceeding would appear ruthless. Pausing would appear weak. Catherine turned away for a moment, not to hide emotion, but to steady it. In this fictional palace world, she had never asked to be lifted. Through scandal, she had expected duty to arrive. She had not expected it to arrive like this, with another woman's collapse, burning itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. Charles, meanwhile, faced a smaller room and a harder silence. When he entered the recovery suite where Camilla had been taken, the atmosphere had none of the formality of the chamber they had just left. No clerks, no council table, no velvet language, only the human wreckage left behind when official decisions collide with personal trust. Camilla did not reach for him. She did not ask whether the wording had been misunderstood. She did not ask whether a correction could still be made. In this dramatized telling, she had already crossed beyond denial. She asked something worse. "Why did you let me sit there without warning me?" Charles hesitated. And the hesitation answered more than any explanation could. He admitted that discussions had been happening. He insisted he had hoped for delay. He claimed the final immediacy had not been fully plain until late. But by then, the distinction had lost its value. Camilla looked at him with the kind of disbelief that appears only when someone realizes they were not lied to, directly only protected with partial truths, until the damage became irreversible. And sometimes that feels more unforgivable. Later that evening, another detail surfaced, one that widened the story beyond the chamber. William reviewed background material tied to the settlement and found that objections to Camilla's continuing authority had not begun that week. They had been gathering quietly, folded into procedural notes, ceremonial concerns, and succession planning papers over a much longer stretch. The turning point, however, seemed to circle back to a private incident months earlier, one that had never reached the public and was dismissed at the time as a tense but manageable disagreement. In this dramatized palace timeline, the incident took place during a closed rehearsal at Windsor involving future state arrangements. No cameras, no audience, no statement, just a room, a formation, and one instruction that exposed how fragile the balance had become. These are the moments institutions remember, not because they are loud, but because they reveal the truth before anyone is ready to name it. And what happened at Windsor had done exactly that. The rehearsal was supposed to settle ceremonial order, and the event duties had to shift quickly between generations. In plain terms, it was about positions, timing, representation, who stands where, who steps forward when, and what message the monarchy sends before a single word is spoken. Camilla entered, believing the hierarchy remained clear. Catherine's profile might be growing, but growth from Camilla's perspective did not equal overlap. Then came the instruction that changed everything. Camilla ordered a rearrangement that moved Catherine away from the most visible consort placement and placed herself firmly back at the symbolic center. The words were measured. The meaning was not William challenged it immediately. Catherine in this fictional account tried to quiet the moment before it spread, but once senior staff witnessed an approved plan being overwritten to preserve one woman's precedence over another's rising role, the issue stopped being private irritation and started looking like institutional obstruction. A written note was filed. Charles reviewed it. He reversed the adjustment, quietly hoping silence would contain the fracture. Instead, silence preserved it for later use. When Camilla later learned that the Windsor note had been included in the case against her, her anger found a new direction, not because the note itself removed her, but because it revealed how the palace had reinterpreted her instincts. What she viewed as defense of her place had been translated into evidence that her place was impeding transition. That is the danger of closed systems. They rarely judge only what was done. They judge what the act suggests about the future. Catherine became part of that future, whether she wanted the symbolism or not. And once Camilla understood that the old rehearsal had been revived as proof, she requested a private meeting with Catherine herself. No advisors, no household intermediaries. No polished messages carried room to room by people pretending neutrality. If she was going to hear the truth, she wanted it. Without palace cushioning, Catherine agreed, because by then she understood that leaving the matter to whispers would poison everything that followed, especially for William. The crown could survive tension. What it could not survive easily was rot. Their first private conversation after the collapse was not gentle. Camilla did not arrive looking for comfort. She arrived looking for clarity sharpened enough to cut through ambiguity. Did you know? That was her opening. Did you know? They were giving you what was mine. Catherine held the gaze longer than Camilla expected. She admitted she knew discussions about role and structure had intensified, but said she had not been told the transfer would be made immediate that morning. Camilla heard the answer and found little relief in it. Knowing part of a storm is still knowing a storm is building. She accused Catherine of benefiting from years of quiet criticism that had slowly gathered around her position. Catherine's restraint thinned, though it did not disappear. She answered that she had not engineered another woman's humiliation and did not experience the new title as a victory. She had seen the collapse with her own eyes. She knew every future appearance would be measured against it. In this dramatized exchange, that response did not heal anything, but it shifted something. Camilla began to sense that Catherine had not been the main architect, which left only a smaller, more dangerous circle. Then Catherine said the sentence that changed the room. Ask who signed it. Camilla did not respond right away. She did not need to. The implication had already landed later. When the authorization page was placed in front of her, she scanned the names, expecting advisors, secretaries, legal hands. Perhaps William's influence reflected indirectly. But then her eyes stopped where the chain of authority truly ended. Charles, his approval, sat there like a seal on every fear she had tried to resist. In that instant, the conflict ceased to be a rivalry between two women. It became something colder and far more final. The king had not simply failed to stop the transfer. In this fictionalized account, he had allowed the machinery to move and then given it the final force it needed. That distinction matters. A powerless husband is one thing, a sovereign who signs is another. Camilla could challenge gossip. She could challenge household politics. She could even challenge William's growing influence. But she could not challenge the signature that turned possibility into law within the palace walls. Charles knew what that signature would come to represent, which is why he had delayed as long as he could. That at least was how he saw it in his mind. Postponement had been a form of mercy. But in crises like this, delay can harden into a different kind of cruelty. If it allows someone to remain calm only because the truth is being withheld. Advisors in this dramatized royal scenario argued that the monarchy had already entered its next phase in practice, while its internal structure remained tied to a previous one. On paper, Catherine carried a larger public load. William's future position was expanding. Ceremonial contradictions were multiplying. The Windsor incident had simply exposed how unstable the arrangement had become. William refused to demand Camilla's removal directly because he knew that would make the transfer look self-serving. That choice, however principled, left Charles with nowhere to hide. If the institution changed, it would change by the king's hand. If it did not, it would remain frozen by the king's fear. He chose motion, and in choosing motion, he broke the last illusion Camilla still had about where she stood when duty and marriage collided. The next morning did more damage than the council chamber had, because palaces make change real through routine. A missing folder can wound more deeply than a formal speech. A reassigned briefing can confirm what denial still tries to resist. In this dramatic script, Camilla woke into a quieter kind of dispossession. The daily packet tied to ceremonial matters did not arrive. A meeting once considered automatic disappeared from her schedule. Staff who had long waited for her direction were suddenly checking with another office. Nothing was announced harshly, no one behaved rudely. That almost made it worse. Erasure performed politely is still erasure, Camilla noticed. The first omission quickly. When she asked where the briefing material was, the answer came. With practiced softness, the office now handling queenly scheduling would review distribution. She did not need the sentence explained, she understood it immediately. The title had left the document and entered the corridors. Charles came later, hoping perhaps to offer reassurance about charity's patronages continued. Visibility, the carefully preserved fragments of a roll after its center has been removed. But reassurance sounded thin inside a morning already reorganized around her absence. Then something unexpected arrived. From Catherine's side, in this fictional narrative, Catherine refused to move into the private office. Spaces previously associated with Camilla's position, she instructed staff to leave personal belongings untouched until Camilla chose what should be removed, what should remain, and what should be handled with discretion. The message traveled back through a household aide. For the first time since the collapse, Camilla's anger lost its clean shape. Because this was not the conduct of a woman savoring conquest. It was the conduct of someone trying imperfectly to prevent transition from becoming desecration that unsettled Camilla more than open triumph would have. Hatred is easier to manage when the other person behaves like an enemy. Compassion complicates the script. By evening, she sent Catherine a handwritten request for another meeting. No officials, no prepared language, no Charles. If the first conversation had been about blame, this second one would be about what remained when blame no longer changed the outcome. When the two women met again, the room felt different. The fury had burned down into something quieter, and quiet can be more dangerous because it leaves nowhere to hide. Camilla spoke first. She said losing the title had hurt, but what cut deeper was realizing she had entered the chamber, believing Charles would still shield her from the full force of palace logic. Title mattered, yes, but the disappearance of that trust mattered more. Catherine listened without interruption, then offered a truth of her own. Receiving the position had not felt like a coronation of ambition. It had felt like stepping into responsibility through someone else's pain. Every appearance from that point on, she said, would carry the memory of the collapse, whether anyone spoke of it aloud or not. Camilla then asked the question that had been lurking beneath everything else. Would Catherine take all of it? The office, the causes, the identity? The years? Catherine answered no immediately. Formal succession, she said, did not require personal obliteration. Some things belonged to the institution, others belonged to the life a person had built within it. That answer did not repair the wound, but it prevented it from widening. In this dramatized version, Camilla then did something neither woman had expected that morning. She took a set of handwritten notes from her bag. They were not official papers. They were private observations gathered over years beside the sovereign notes about pressures no briefing ever explains, warnings about the loneliness hidden behind ceremonial grace, small truths about timing public expectation, and the strange discipline of never reacting when reaction would feel most human. She handed them to Catherine without ceremony, not as surrender, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that the transfer would stand, and that one woman could still decide whether the next would inherit only the title or also the knowledge needed to survive it. Catherine accepted them carefully. No dramatic embrace followed, no miraculous healing that would have felt false. What emerged instead was narrower and more believable, a fragile understanding between two people caught inside a machine larger than either of them, each wounded by it in a different way. Outside the palace, of course, none of that nuance survived first contact with the public story. By the next morning, in this fictional account, the private crisis had become a national spectacle. Newsrooms tore apart pre-written front pages. Commentators argued over duty, ambition, fairness, symbolism, and the future face of the monarchy. The formal announcement from the palace used controlled language, describing Catherine's new standing as part of a broader transition within the royal structure. But controlled language does not stay controlled once it reaches headlines. For many observers, the story became brutally simple, one woman rising while another disappeared from the center. For others, it looked like a delayed institutional correction finally breaking through private resistance. Catherine heard the coverage and rejected the celebratory tone attached to her name. Camilla heard the same coverage and felt the loss become public in a way the collapse alone had not achieved. Private grief is one thing, public framing is another. When strangers begin summarizing your years into a finished chapter, the ending starts to feel official in a harsher way than any sealed council paper. One image came to define the entire day: Catherine entering through one gate as Camilla's car departed through another. In a palace drama, images do what paragraphs cannot. They compress power loss, timing, and implication into a single unbearable comparison. Crowds formed behind barriers. Some voiced excitement, others expressed sympathy. Most seemed unsure whether they were witnessing renewal or damage disguised as order. William watched the first wave of reaction with a seriousness that surprised even his own aides. He understood that the monarchy had resolved one contradiction only by creating another. Catherine now carried the title the institution believed matched the future, but she carried it under a cloud. No formal announcement could disperse. Camilla had lost rank without losing memory presence or the relationships that made the loss painful. Charles had preserved the crown's direction at the cost of personal trust he might never fully rebuild. Everyone outside wanted a victor. Inside there was none. By the time the family prepared for their first appearance after the announcement, the real meaning of the crisis had become painfully clear. The decision had not simply replaced one woman with another, it had accelerated a transition before emotion was ready for it, before marriage could adjust to it, before the people involved could protect themselves from the human cost of being positioned as symbols rather than individuals. Camilla understood then that the title would not return. Catherine understood that duty had arrived with scars already attached. Charles understood, perhaps too late, that secrecy had not softened the blow, it had sharpened it. In one final private exchange imagined for this script, he apologized for allowing duty to become concealment. Camilla answered with the truth that haunted the entire story. The loss of the title was painful, yes, but discovering he had been afraid to tell her the truth was worse. He did not defend himself. There was nothing left to defend. And that is what made those 4 minutes matter so much, not because a palace title moved on paper, not even because Camilla collapsed in shock when the words were spoken. Those were the visible moments, the headline moments, the moments people would repeat. But the deeper fracture came from what those 4 minutes exposed. They revealed that silence had replaced trust, that transition had been planned behind the protection of careful language, and that the crown, once forced to choose between emotional loyalty and institutional momentum, had chosen momentum. Catherine stepped forward, but not in triumph. Camilla stepped back, but not without dignity. Charles remained king, but not without consequence. In this dramatized royal account, the chamber changed in 4 minutes. The relationships inside it may have changed for much longer. And once a palace decision strips away the illusion that love and duty can always survive side by side, even the crown itself begins to look heavier than it did before.